There we go. So after you get up from sitting, then what? Quite often, as people begin a contemplative practice, they are quite disappointed that it seems as if nothing is happening during their time of sitting. We're so accustomed to thinking that when we pray, we should hear something or feel something, get some satisfaction from sitting there for 20 or 30 minutes. However, in contemplation, that really doesn't happen. Remember, contemplation is really a dropping down, an emptying, a letting go. It's an opening of oneself to the workings of the divine within you, inviting you to a spaciousness from which you encounter divine love. And in doing that, you're going to be encountering your authentic or true self, so that we can respond to our life situations, whatever they are, out of love and not fear. And sitting prepares us for that and helps us create that space. There's a great story that Thomas Keating often tells, that someone said that they thought they were talking to the Blessed Virgin Mary at prayer. And he said, even if you think that's what's happening, let it go. Let it go and return to your word or return to your breath. And that seems symbolic to what I want to talk about, which is really the transformation that happens after you get up from sitting. Because over time, you will awaken to your true self. Now you might say, well, why do we want to do that? Because don't we know who we are? Well, this journey to self is at the invitation of Jesus. Jesus is considered by many as a wisdom teacher. The wisdom tradition was quite strong at the time of Jesus's life in the Near East. And because of the way he taught in parables and using the things of the earth and talking in the way that he did, people think that he probably came out of that tradition. And so what he invites us to is really coming to get to know who we are. He invited us to a new way of seeing. He had a different worldview than that of first century Palestine. He accepted people for who they were and not determined by the purity laws that were part of his culture. Excuse me for a second because I'm trying to get the, there we go. Perhaps if you might have to turn, close up, if you can't see the whole screen, you probably need to take me off the screen and just see the PowerPoint. I'm sorry about this. So Jesus invited a different way of seeing than was practiced in first century Palestine. What do I mean? There was a whole set of purity laws. So all the people that Jesus embraced and brought into his table of the Eucharistic table were people that were considered impure or impure in that first century Palestine. It was a call to become fully alive. He healed and invited people to tell him what they wanted him to do for them. I'm always struck by the Bartimaeus, because that blind man standing at the gate, and here, I probably would have gone up and said, hey, I can heal you. And he doesn't do that. But Jesus says, what is it that you want me to do for you? He needed people to sense what they needed to come to their true self. And he invites us to drop down where human nature and divine love mysteriously intertwine. Think about the Gospel of John. Jesus tells us that we are one with him and his Abba God, and that they will come and dwell within us, and that we will do greater things than they. So it is a call to transformation, and a transformation that happens over time. Through contemplative practice, one becomes more aware of one's false self or the constructed self. That's a term that Robert Kegan, the psychologist at Harvard, developed. And for those of you who have done Enter the Chaos, you might remember how we talked about the stages of consciousness, sort of creating these constructed self. It's all the values and characteristics that we think of when we think, who should I be? What's a leader? What's going to make me happy? What's important? What's meaningful in life? And quite often they're really like put on us, they're constructed, and we construct who we are. And then we become aware of biases and assumptions, beliefs and worldviews. And over time, at least for sure in my experience, you begin to a desire to act differently. And what you are able to do is develop what we'll call witnessing presence. So this process then is one of an interior journey. And contemplative practice facilitates this interior journey or inner awakening. Ken Wilber, who really has been the leader in the movement that is called the integral theory movement, he uses the image of a conveyor belt to show this movement. So it is through contemplative practice that we move from, in a sense, an unconscious remote control kind of living, sort of being asleep. I don't know if many of you might have seen that movie, Don't Look Up. It's a perfect example, telling people just don't look up and you won't know that a crater is going to destroy us in just a few months. It's just, if you just keep your head down, if you just keep your head in the sand, that's good. You don't need to know what's going on. Keep yourself distracted. Some of you might remember The Brave New World. And unlike 1994 or 1984, we were going to be destroyed from within, not from without. And so part of that's because we're so unconscious in what we do and why we do it. So you move from unconscious remote control living to more awakening to your experience. You begin to sense something's going on inside of you when you find yourself reacting to things. You know, when you start to push up against, now, why am I responding to that group of Asians over there the way I am? Or what's the matter with me when I get so angry at Trump, if that's, or Biden, whatever your political persuasion. And so you start to be aware of your experience. And then you move to reflecting directly on it. So you begin to ask, why do I think this way? Or why do I believe this? And eventually, you become unattached to your experience. Now, this doesn't mean you're disembodied or you're distant from experience. Quite the opposite. You're beginning to use all your centers of knowing. They say we know from our head, from our heart, and from our gut. And all of them we have to sort of bring online in today's language. And eventually the heart becomes not just a seat of emotions, but an organ of perception. And you begin to see in new ways until you are able to embrace each moment unconditionally by the power of the divine indwelling active within you. And then from that place, which we will call witnessing presence, choose how to respond to any given situation. So responding from that place of witnessing presence is not merely about remembering what to do. It's not just intellectual. And I can clearly remember when I knew what I needed to do intellectually. And then when the shift came, it's rather amazing. It is really seeing from within, from the heart as an organ of perception, a sensing of another dimension in our lives. And this presence is carried in our knowing heart and pulls us toward our center, even in the midst of whatever is happening. Cynthia Bourgeault, who some of you know, is an Episcopal priest. They're considered a modern mystic. And she has a marvelous image. She says, talks about the magnetic center of divine love. And when I think of a magnet, it's so that it gets drawn so quickly when you get so close to it, and then it just holds it so tightly. And thinking about within us is this magnetic center of divine love to which we are being drawn. So we can be in the midst of chaos, in the midst of suffering, in the midst of happiness. And what we are able to do is lose our reactivity, just our reaction to everything, and our attachment to the single outcome which we know is the only way to solve the problem, which is my way of doing it. We are truly When I was growing up, someone told me that I could always figure out where north was. North is in front of you. And then I started turning around, and everywhere I turned, north went with me. So it was sort of like North by Nancy. We've got to get unattached from that as we begin our interior journey inward. So how does it happen? How can we manage to stay connected to that deepest self and respond from love? How does the true self come more and more online? How do we become so aware that we're not really reacting to everything, so that a whole new way of seeing and being arises in us? How does this authentic true self become more visible to us? Well, think of a glacier. You know, we think we know ourselves, but that is only the part of us that is above water, visible to us. Like a glacier, there's much more hidden below the surface of things. So remember that conveyor belt. This is the remote control stage of awareness. So it isn't unusual that the earliest stages of waking up, which is what we're doing, often come as people begin to pray more deeply and begin to notice their own faults and failings. You begin to be aware of your experience and reflect on it. And so people resist sometimes, saying, it feels like I'm getting worse. And why am I doing this? I don't need to know all this about myself. And I can testify to that. When I first seriously engaged in my inner journey, my inner work with a spiritual director, I'd have to say I was pretty shocked at what came up in me. Feelings and attitudes that I didn't know were operative. I had quite a few good disguises, ways of keeping me from seeing that, keeping me asleep. So as we continue, we begin to notice when our buttons get pushed and how we react in ways that are no longer useful to us. So then this going deeper into the water initiates the movement on the conveyor belt to become unattached to our experience. Again, it doesn't mean we're not connected to it in a way. It's just the attachment's no longer addictive to us. After being very conscious in our bodies as to how I am responding emotionally to this upset, or psychologically, or intellectually, to people and to situations, then very important healing process can begin. And here I want to draw on the teachings of Thomas Keating, who talks about the 3 energy centers which we are born with. And here, those of you who have done psychology or have done a number of things within psychology, you'll see a lot of parallels because good psychology and good spirituality go together. And he talks about these 3 energy centers: the need for security and survival, the need for affection and esteem, and the need for power and control. Now, these are very natural needs, and he says they're never fully satisfied because of perceived or real deprivations from when we are very little all through life. And I suspect, even as I read them, you might have been feeling something in you. You may have tensed or relaxed or nodded in recognition. For these 3 energy centers are deep within us. It is said that when we react out of those centers, the part of our brain gets activated is our lizard or a reptilian brain. It's the one that appears very early in our evolutionary process. However, as we enter the age of reason, our mental capacities also come in play. We use our rational faculties to justify, glorify, and rationalize our behavior. We develop a set of protective behaviors driven by a sense of need and lack. And Keating calls this the false self system. This being so caught up in one or more of those energy centers that we create a whole set of protective behaviors constructing ourselves, and we think that's who we are and while we'll be made happy. And he says what it really does is repress or inappropriately express the feelings generated when those energy centers are frustrated. And he says the programs for happiness, which we build around them, cannot possibly work for us. So Keating goes on and he talks about the false self as blind to these needy, driven, unrecognized motivations that govern our behavior. That's what keeps us unaware, keeps us asleep. It is back to that conveyor belt, that remote control kind of living. This false self is drawn to addictive energy with emotional investment in those compensatory emotional programs for happiness. Now, think about these centers for a minute. Can you find yourself identifying with any of them? I can. It's the affection and esteem one. I'm a 3 on the Enneagram. And as I've reflected over the years how I so needed affirmation, it is embarrassing. But I was blind to it and addicted to what I thought I needed to make me happy. It is also controlled by a repression or inappropriate expression of the feelings generated when energy centers are frustrated. I was thinking about jealousy. Here's jealousy with the persons you like and need to like you. That's an inappropriate expression of the feelings of love. And it comes, this false self system comes into consciousness in the form of attractions and aversions. So let's say control or power is your emotional program for happiness. You might find yourself attracted to strong women or men and avoid people you might categorize as wimpy or mousy. And you'll sometimes use pejorative language for that which you judge to be not as valuable. Some of these may seem rather small, but I know in my life they really are, they're the visible parts of this much deeper addiction that one has to start to let go of. And it also triggers an internal dialogue of pre-recorded commentaries. It's the tapes in our head get going. Things like you see someone at a party, let's say you're younger, maybe even older, and you say, just look at her. She is throwing herself at him. I'd never do that. No one should, and on and on and on. You have all of these pre-recorded commentaries that help to justify your way of being in the world and what you see as important, and hopefully you hope to bring happiness. So Keating says the true self is buried beneath the accretions and defenses held in place by the false self. We need to escape the gravitational pull of self-justification and psychological woundedness. I find that so powerful, the gravitational pull. I mean, just like the magnetic center pulls us and holds us, we have to escape from this pull of self-justification, of why we're this woundedness. And I think self-justification is so seductive. You can rationalize almost anything. And I'm sure you may know someone who has never say they're sorry, who always can point to or suggest how someone else was at fault. It's a very difficult defense to let go of. And it's this false self who identifies with this desire for happiness, rooted in these 3 energy centers, in ways which can't possibly work, says Keating, that we must detach from. So Keating teaches that contemplative prayer, and in particular centering prayer, is a direct catalyst to this process of purification and the healing of the unconscious. As one sits in centering prayer with the intent to rest in and trust in God, the unconscious begins to unload the emotional junk of a lifetime. And this requires courage and inner presence to sustain the pull of our woundedness and self-justification. Now, clearly, spirituality cannot solve every psychological problem. And for many people, there may be need of professional help. But for many, this kind of healing process has been established, and Thomas Keating and the people who have worked with him over the years shows how this can be very effective in terms of letting the junk of that lifetime begin to fall away. So Keating believes that the gift of contemplative prayer is a practical and essential tool for confronting the struggle with our unconscious motivations, because you are always letting go of what your false self thinks is important when you sit. When you start to think about other things, it's that what I want to think about should be tended to. And in contemplative prayer, you let it go. It also establishes a climate and necessary dispositions for a relationship with God and leading to divine union. It is a descent into the ground of our own psyche. The periods of psychological ferment and destabilization are signs that the journey is progressing, not that it is a failure. In response to each significant descent into the ground of our woundedness, there is a parallel ascent in the form of inner freedom. One begins to experience the fruits of the Spirit, or the fruit of the Spirit, as Paul talks about it. And they are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Not simply as just ideas or niceties that we put out there, but they're being embodied by us in our very humanness, which has met the divine within us. And so as we detach from these impossible programs for happiness, those energy centers to which we are addicted, we find ourselves responding from the place of witnessing presence, where we can observe and participate in the world from divine love, rather than from fear or blame. We are growing in our capacity to respond from our authentic and true selves, from Christ consciousness. And we see in others the underlying original wholeness and infinite potential. We see first our unity and then our differentiation. We begin to see the whole before the parts. Then we can reach out in dialogue and true service. We can offer to our world the fruit of the Spirit for its healing and wholeness. So this is the transformational power of contemplation. Connie Fitzgerald, a Baltimore Carmelite, and quite someone who's very influential in my life, writes that those who teach the next generation need to understand and believe in the transformative character of contemplative process, because this process is integral, not only to fully develop humanity, but also to the new form of human existence struggling to be born. And there are many authors who believe we are at that place where the next stage of consciousness is emerging. And that is why so much of the kind of chaos we're experiencing is that it's the death of a prior time, and we're in emergence time. And so therefore, we need to be aware of the power of contemplation so that continue that evolutionary thrust of the earth and the universe. We contribute to the unfolding of the next stage of consciousness. And Connie continues, this may be the most basic challenge of religion today, education for a transformative contemplation, which would radically affect human motivation, consciousness, desire, and ultimately every other area of human life and endeavor. We begin to live Jesus' message. We begin to live out of Christ consciousness. We begin to live Christianity. And so that's what happens after you get up from sitting.